Hey guys, we're going to be continuing with 13-7, graphing translations, okay? So everything that we talked about in our first set of videos for 13-7, we are actually going to implement by drawing the graphs themselves. So to start off, I'm going to ask that you take a look at these three multiple choice questions that are on page 882 to review the rules. So number 55 says, which function is a phase shift of y equals sine theta by 5 units to the left? Remember, the vocabulary word phase shift means horizontal change. And a horizontal shift always happens inside the function. Okay? Now, when it is inside the function and we want to move left, remember we want to pick a sign that is to the opposite sign. So left is towards the negative numbers, so I will have a plus within my equation. So we can immediately rule out A and D because there's no plus, and we have to choose between B and C. Which one of these has the plus 5 on the inside of the function? Well, that would be choice C because 5 is inside the parentheses. Choice B would actually be a shift up 5 units. Okay. Which function is a translation of y equals cosine theta by 5 units down? Now remember, 5 units down means we have a vertical shift, which we should always know is outside the function. Okay, meaning it's not going to be inside the trig parentheses. And down will be represented with a negative sign. So we can immediately eliminate F and I because there's no subtraction here. Those are both multiplication. And now we have to figure out which one of the choices, G or H, has the minus 5 on the outside of the function. And that's going to be choice G. Now finally, number 57, let's combine the two. Which function is a translation of y equals sine theta that is pi over 3 units up and pi over 2 units to the left? Well, pi over 3 units up means plus pi over 3. Up means outside. And pi over 2 units to the left tells me left is going to be a positive value on the inside. Okay, so let's take a look at our answer choices. A plus pi over 2 on the inside. Well, we only have one of those, which is choice B. Does it have a plus pi over 3 on the outside? Yes. So our answer choice is plus B. So hopefully at this point we are getting more comfortable and confident with our transformations. Now we want to put them to paper. Okay, so we're going to start with the easier graphs and make our way to the hardest graphs. We have the graph y equals 3 sine x plus 4. Okay, we want to graph that on the interval from 0 to 2 pi. So however many cycles we need to do to get to 2 pi, we want to make sure we do this. Now, up until this point, we only talked about graphing equations like 3 sine of x. And what did we need to be able to graph that? Well, first I needed my amplitude, which is the number in front, 3. Then I needed to find my period, which I found by taking 2 pi and dividing it by the b value, which in this case is a 1. So my period is 2 pi. The next thing we did was we looked for what our interval will be on our x-axis. Okay, which we did by taking 2 pi and dividing it by 4. Okay, so all of our major points, right, our zeros, our maxes, and our mins are going to be pi over 2 units away from each other. So now how does this plus 4 change any of this? Well, it's going to take every point of this 3 sine of x and shift it up plus 4. Okay, so let's start with a quick sketch of 3 sine x, and then we will shift it up. So 3 sine x, remember, sine starts at 0, 0, and we're going to label our axis with our divided by 4 value. So that's pi over 2. That is pi. That's 3 pi over 2. And that is 2 pi. Now, luckily, since our period is 2 pi, we should only see one cycle here. Now, for the parent function, 3 sine of x, we would start at 0, make our way up to the amplitude, which is 3, right? Go back down to 0, make our way to the amplitude in the negative direction, which is negative 3, and back up to 0, making this graph that looks like this. Now, I draw this with a dashed line because this is not the graph we want. What we want is this graph shifted up 4 units. So every major point, I'm going to take it and shift it up 1, 2, 3, 4. So my graph is now going to start there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Shift up to there. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And 1, 2, 3, 4. And connect these points. All right. So that blue one is my graph on the interval from 0 to 2 pi. So let's talk about some features. Maybe let's make this a little bit easier for ourselves. That plus 4 at the end here, right? We remember corresponds to my midline. Okay? So it is the place where these zeros are shifted to. Okay? So that's going to be shifted to 4. And we see that by shifting all the points, that does actually happen. Okay? Now, what else happens? Well, we know that to find my maximum value, I can take my midline and add my amplitude. And I could take to find my minimum, I could take my midline and subtract my amplitude, giving me 7 and 1. Okay, and if we take a look, 4, 5, 6, 7, that's exactly where my graph falls in between. Okay, so if you wanted to graph this without shifting the whole thing, typically I would graph the midline, the maximum, and the minimum, and continue following our pattern. Okay, so let's try that for the next one. We want to graph y equals 2 cosine of 4x shifted down 3 units. Okay, so we are going to start the same way. We're going to identify our amplitude, which is 2. And we're going to identify our period, which is 2 pi divided by my frequency, which in this case is 4. So my period is pi over 2. Okay, so we should see one full cycle in pi over 2 units. All right, now, noting that my frequency is 4, since I'm graphing from 0 to 2 pi, I will have 4 full cycles on this graph. Okay, so you have to bear with me in terms of this. So now what am I labeling my x-axis with? Well, I'm taking the pi over 2, and I'm dividing it by 4, just as I always do, to get pi over 8. Okay, so now since we are graphing more than just one cycle, I'm going to make my life a little bit simpler and make each one of these lines equal to that number. Okay, which means a major feature of my graph, a max, a min, or a 0, will happen at every line on this graph. Okay, so now I need to label my axis, and I want to make my way all the way up to 2 pi. Okay, so remember, I take pi over 8, and I add pi over 8 to it to get to my next one, which is pi over 4. And I keep adding pi over 8 as I go through. Now, I already have these reduced just to speed up the process a little bit, but feel free to work through them all together. Pi, 9 pi over 8, 5 pi over 4, 11 pi over 8, 3 pi over 2, 13 pi over 8, 7 pi over 4, 15 pi over 8, and 2 pi. Okay, So those are all of my labels. Now, let me label this axis. And again, I'm just going to make my life a little bit easier and just not skip too many spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. -1, -2, -3. Okay. So now we could start by graphing out the parent function if we wanted to, the 2 cosine 4x. But let's try my trick. We know that my midline is at -3. Okay, so that midline is going to be right about here. So that means any points that would have fallen on my x-axis will now fall on my midline. Okay, now what is my maximum value? Well, my maximum value is my amplitude, right, plus my midline. Okay, so 2 minus 3 is a -1. That is going to be my maximum value. And my minimum value is going to be my amplitude minus my my midline value. So now let me see that for a second. Well, I know it's going to go 2 up and 2 down. So that should be, yeah, -3, -2 is the better way of doing this. Because we know it's going to have to be in the negative direction because it's a minimum. Okay, so that means my graph is going to fall in between these two values. So now, anything that would have been at my maximum is going to start at -1. Anything that would have been at my minimum will start at -5. Okay, so cosine. We know it's positive, right? So we're going to start at our maximum. In this case, that's going to be a -1. So at 0, I have a -1. Now remember, at every line on this graph, we are going to have a major feature. So pi over 8 is going to be a 0, right? Because we're following the pattern. Pi over 4 will be down to my minimum. And we keep following until we hit one full cosine graph. Now notice, right, that ends at pi over 2. Which is my period, so that makes sense. Now, because we're graphing from 0 to 2 pi, I have to continue. So what's my pattern? Well, I start at my max, I go to my midline, minimum, midline, max. That's our second full cycle. Follow it again. Maximum to 0, 0 to minimum, minimum to midline, back up. And again. Here, 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 and here. Okay, giving us our 4 full cycles graphed. All right. Now you could have graphed the original parent function and shifted